Welcome to Living Hope. With today's teaching, here's the Reverend Richard Brunton.
Hello, welcome to the Living Hope Ministries Word Today. And today we're continuing our theme of looking at characters that are not so well known. Now, sometimes the story is well known. When we looked at Jairus, the story of his daughter and the wonderful way that Jesus raised her from the dead, well, that's well known, but we don't know a great deal about Jairus. In the book of Daniel, well, there are a number of characters. There are those kings, those dictators, those ruthless leaders who would put people to death without hardly a thought. And we could spend some time looking at one of them. But today I want us to look at the three characters, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. These are very, very powerful young men. They're powerful because their commitment to God is incredibly strong, despite the fact that they're living in a very hostile environment. Daniel, of course, is very well known, and indeed, over the years, one has taught much about Daniel. But the three young men who served with him under King Nebuchadnezzar, they are worthy of note. The Bible tells us then that these young men, like Daniel, they had been chosen in order that they might be of service to the king. They were chosen because it was considered they had potential. They weren't chosen because they were liked. It was because Nebuchadnezzar felt that he could extract from them some intelligence, some projects, different things that would help him in his kingdom. And in that sense, he was wise, because some despots just wanted to destroy anyone who was in the enemy camp. But he sees that if there are people who could be useful to his kingdom and his cause, well, why not use them? Well, there's a curious thing that brings to the forefront Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. In the early days of the prophecy of Daniel, they are there. They have joined in the fast, as it were, from the rich foods offered to the other chosen people. And obviously they knew Daniel and respected Daniel, but they were there in the background seeking to uphold their faith in the God of Israel and seeking to be good subjects to the king. They knew the wisdom of not deliberately crossing him. And one of the things is that, yes, Daniel is the one who has, if you like, the most favor, the one who the king has a particular interest and a trust in. But the three men, because they have Daniel's backing, the king is also prepared to trust them and work with them too. And there is a situation that arises where the three young men are at the forefront of a very potentially dangerous situation. The king has set up this incredible image, and you can read about it in detail in chapter 3, and it's an image really of himself, and the whole idea in the mind of the king is that he will have a tremendous celebration. The orchestra will be out in full, and they will be playing to the top of their ability. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a moment amongst all the ceremony when everybody will be commanded, hardly requested, commanded to bow down and to worship the image which has been set up. Now, one gets the impression that the king did have a degree of a sense. There might be some rebellion, some disobedience, and he had this fiery furnace, and he wanted it to be in full working order on the day that he asks the people to bow down and worship the image. The fact that he has it there, as I've said, he's preparing that should anyone dare to reject his edict, then they will be thrown into the furnace. Notice that the procedure is that there'll be all kinds of music playing, and it's at that point that they must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And the comment strongly made is that whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So there's going to be no mercy in terms of the edict. Judgment will be swift. If you hesitate, you will be thrown into that furnace. And people would certainly have some idea that the intensity of the fire in this furnace would normally destroy anyone in seconds. So, at the sound of the music, it's all set up, and what's said is this: the astrologers who denounce the Jews, they say, you've made this edict, king, and you've indicated that when the music plays, that people must bow down and worship. But there are some Jews who you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. One of the things I find, I would say, quite irritating really, is that, think about it, there's a vast crowd of people. It would be difficult to count the number of people. And yet you have in the midst of this assembly, as it were, spies, people looking. They're actually actively looking. Now, you wonder if they're looking all around who's not bowing down, then were they bowing down? How did they see that people weren't bowing down? It reminds me of the wisdom of Jesus when the men bring the lady to Jesus who's been caught in the act of adultery. And remember how they say, look, caught in the very act, what are you going to do? But what sick pastime these people had to be watching events in a bedroom in order to report this is what we saw. I mean, what a sick mind it is to have that sort of appetite to want to discover something in order to report it. No wonder Jesus utters those incredible words of wisdom, he that is without sin cast the first stone. That's not just the men who came with the woman demanding that justice be meted out. But if they were among that group who watched and saw the adultery taking place, then again, they're as sick as the man who commits adultery. Not saying that the woman is innocent, but frankly, and maybe it's just my view as a man, but I don't know that she had a lot of choice. I think she found herself caught in a situation where perhaps to have refused would have put her in a lot of trouble, even possible death. But okay, she was complicit, she was guilty. And the people who are watching these events, the statue that's been built, hearing the music play, and knowing if there are people who don't bow down, that they're going to be under the king's wrath. I think it's very sad that some people that day took upon it themselves to be like spies and to try and find some people who they could get into trouble. Well, of course, what they observe is right. That the three men, they do not observe what King Nebuchadnezzar said. They don't worship the image of gold. They don't worship the gods of Nebuchadnezzar. And the report comes to Nebuchadnezzar, and we're told he was furious with rage. Remember that his integrity, his pride is very much at the forefront, and if he fails to deliver the judgment that has been stated, then he looks somewhat foolish. But the men are brought to the king, and when the king sees who is being brought, I don't say that he changes his mind, but he certainly now realizes that the men accused of, if you like, treason, rebellion, disobedience, that these are godly men. He knows them. He knows Daniel, and he knows these three men. I can't tell you how well he knew them, but he knew them well enough to have put them in a position of some esteem. He knew them well enough to feel that if Daniel trusted them, they were to be trusted. And he has these men brought before him. They're not thrown immediately into the fiery furnace. They're brought before him. And he says, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and that you do not worship the image of gold that I've set up?" Now, when you hear the sound of all kinds of music, then if you're ready to fall down and worship, then you will be spared. But if you do not, you will be thrown into the fiery furnace. And he adds, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? He's aware that there is something special about these men. Even though we virtually only know their names, there is something that speaks about these men, their honesty, their purity, their whole attitude. It's the sort of reaction that Pilate gives when he has the Lord Jesus in front of him. And he is not just going to treat Jesus like any other Jew. There's something clearly special about Jesus. And Pilate has a kind of respect for who Jesus is, though his fear for losing his position is greater than the respect he has for Jesus. And it's important that we are men and women respected by the people in our community respected that we do the right thing, respected that we are not corrupt and deceitful and tell lies and undermine people around us. That image of someone who's honest, reliable, trustworthy is something that men and women of God do well to cultivate and do well to have recognized by those in authority. But the fact that Nebuchadnezzar adds, and what God can rescue from my hand, it's really quite intriguing how he is obstinate, he's proud, and he's convinced that he's almost deity himself. And therefore, to him it's inconceivable that there is a God in heaven who is greater than him. But the answer of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego is very powerful. We read this: we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. That's not arrogance. That's simply an indication they knew where their responsibility lay in this particular set of circumstances. Their responsibility lied to God. It was to God that they should honour. It was, as far as they were concerned, they didn't see the failure to bow down as a lack of respect for Nebuchadnezzar. What made them feel they could not bow down was the fact that they believed in the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. That they believed that the commandments, that there should be no other God except him, and that you didn't make a graven image and worship it, but that you should give yourself wholly to serving the living God. And they believed that. They believed it implicitly. And consequently, in this situation, they don't have to think about it. They don't have to ponder, and they certainly don't have a little vote among themselves. It's obvious if they're being called upon to worship and bow down to that which is not the true living God, they just can't do it. And it's that sort of faith and that sort of tenacity, that sort of courage, that is what the world needs to see today. It will be interpreted as being obstinate. It will be interpreted as being small-minded. But that doesn't matter what people think. What matters is this an issue that brings me into conflict with the Lord? And if it brings me into conflict with the Lord, well, that's the end of it. There's no more discussion. And so they will not bow down to this image. But then they say this: if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. They are confident in the deliverance of God. They are confident that God is actively working on their side. And again, many of those, even those who've been martyred, they still have that confidence that the Lord is with them. And they're just a great long list of amazing stories of people worshipping, praising God, even if they're going to their very deaths. They are stating to Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to deliver us. And however hot that furnace is, they're simply saying, our lives are in God's hands. You may think that you are in the upper hand position, but in fact you're not. And do you remember how Jesus says to Pilate, if the Father hadn't allowed these circumstances to happen, you'd have no power over me. That confidence that our lives are in God's hands is a supreme confidence. It's something that will always challenge and exercise us and be a provocation to those who want to oppose us. And their statement is just so wonderful, because what they're saying is, if you throw us into the furnace, God is able to deliver us. And ultimately he will deliver us. Even if we die, he'll still deliver us. But they say, if God does not spare our lives, and if we die in the furnace, we still will not bow down. And therefore, we're confident in God. We know that he's with us. We know he will come alongside us in this hour of tremendous adversity. But if we're not physically rescued, we're still not going to go against our God. We're still not going to worship idols. We are still going to serve the living God. Well, we know that Nebuchadnezzar, furious with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, his attitude changes. He's no longer having any sympathy whatsoever. In fact, he orders the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, their trousers, their turbans and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, we read, the furnace so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and these 3 men fell tied into the blazing furnace. That's the extent. It's graphic. It's very, very powerful what is given here to us. But the king, and I don't know if those men who threw the 3 wonderful men of God into the furnace, if they were killed, I don't quite know how this thing was structured, that Nebuchadnezzar is able to look down into this place of such intense heat. But he does look down, and he says to his advisors, he said, were there not 3 men we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, yes, definitely there were 3. And he said, but look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approaches the furnace and calls out to Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And we read as he calls them to come out, come here, they come out of the fire. And all those who were witnesses saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed, their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. And the result was that they are delivered, they are set free, and Nebuchadnezzar has to admit that the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego is greater than any other God. And they're promoted to even higher positions in the kingdom of Babylon. Our God who we serve is able to deliver us. Today we're living in a very troubled world. We're living in a world where we have our Nebuchadnezzar-like figures, ruthless, willing to inflict the most terrible punishments on those who do not obey them. And we see that illustrated in different parts of our world today and the horror of it. But how important it is that our world sees men and women of God who are willing to stand up in the midst of all sorts of aggravation, in the midst of terror, who will be willing to lay down their lives and to declare that the God that we serve is the only true God. There are many, many other people who didn't have a book written about them, who did not have an interview with some major TV broadcasting unit, but who have shown equal courage to Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. We can be proud of these saints, proud of these men of God who laid down their lives for the truth. And as the world grows darker, we need the shining light of men and women of integrity who declare God's in charge, and that even if people take our lives, we will not compromise. That's what Jesus did. He didn't compromise. He went into, like a fiery furnace, even hell, separated from the Father, so that we might come to God. Praise his name. God bless you.